Wouldn't it be good if you could compare what your favourite distillery was making 30 years ago to what they're producing today? Sadly, even for the best of us, memory can be imperfect, and buying antique whisky at auction can be really expensive, so there's not really any easy way to do it. Or is there? Just going to give a quick mention to cheaperbythedram.co.uk. They are not a sponsor, they're just a really good company that takes old and rare whisky and splits it into 30ml samples so that the actual whisky drinkers can get a hold of some of the pricier stuff. Highly recommended that you go and check out their website. So this is a little bit of a rare opportunity here for me to try a Highland Park whisky which is bottled in the 1980s. So this is the standard 12-year-old, but in the dumpy screen printed bottles that it used to come in. So in my last review I looked at the current Highland Park 12-year-old, the Viking Honour, and wasn't hugely impressed with it. I think that over the years it has got a little bit worse. So let's see if that decline in quality has been a gradual process over the decades or if it's just something more recent. So immediately that nose is just so different to what we had on the current modern bottling of the 12-year-old. It's just got such an enormously intense, sweet hit of sherry sweetness. It's a really full and intense sweetness. Also some notes of old leather in there, really nice. Sort of full-term, matured, old sherry casks in there. I'm also wondering if there's a little bit of old bottle effect. It's always hard to tell with these whiskies that have been bottled and kept for a long time. You can never be quite sure if the whiskey that you're drinking is the same as it would have been if you'd have bought it and opened it when it was actually produced. But there's not much we can do about that without a time machine. Getting some lovely nuttiness from the sherry casks, and something that I really like about this bottling is that you get a certain oiliness, an oily, buttery cereal note that you really only get with your older whiskies. I would say that the average age of the whiskey that has gone into this, bottled in the 1980s, is definitely not 12 years old. From those old, oily, malty notes that you're getting, I'd say it's more like 18 to 20. Lovely sweet nuttiness, some effervescent love heart type notes, a gentle heathery peatiness, and some honey as well, and a little bit of that trademark apple note that you get in almost all Highland Parks. Also getting quite a strong beeswax note, and by beeswax I don't mean your run-of-the-mill household candle sort of aroma. Beeswax, for anyone that's handled and smelt it, has got a much sweeter, more pleasant honey note to it. It's in the background, but there is definitely a little hint of peat there as well. But it's a heathery peat, as in keeping with most Highland Park whiskies, and it's also an older, more refined, subtler, gentler peat, the sort of thing that you would get in a whiskey which has been heavily peated when it's produced, but then gone on to mature for 15-20 years. So all in all, the nose is very sweet and very pleasant and intense, and it really hints that this is a much older whiskey than 12 years. So let's see how it tastes. And again on the palate, getting lots of lovely old oily malt notes. There's no way that this is 12 years old. Lovely intense sweet caramel and honey, sweet barley notes. There's also a little bit of a note of fresh walnuts in there, which again is something that you tend to get with older whiskies. And it's a lovely thick and oily coating mouthfeel to this whiskey. It's an intense experience that really grabs you by the taste buds. Starting to run out on this one now, but let's go for a little bit more. That is really lovely. There is a slight bitterness on the palate, which I'm guessing could come from some of those casks. I really do think that this is quite an old, or a lot of the whiskies that have gone into this are quite old. And you're starting to get a little bit of astringency from the casks, but that's just part of the experience, and it's not enough to ruin anything. My only criticism of this whiskey is going to be that the finish is a little bit short. you're just left with a tiny little bit of sort of stale, sour smoke, and again a little bit of that sort of greasy, old, oily maltiness. But really the finish is over very quickly. It really dies off quite fast, which is a bit of a shock because the palate is so rich and intense. But that can often be one of the downsides of bottling a whisky at 40%, even with a really quality whisky like this. In terms of a grade, I'm going to give this whisky an A-. It's really that good. And I'd say if there was more of a finish on it, probably by bottling this at 43 or 46%, it would seriously be in the runnings for one of the best whiskies I've ever tasted. The closest thing that I could compare it to would be the third release of the 1989 Balblair, which I believe was a 23-year-old whisky. In a blind tasting, I think a lot of educated whisky drinkers would be completely forgiven for thinking this was something in that age range. So how does it compare to the current 12-year-old? I would say that there's quite a bit less peat, but that could be because I do suspect that there's more aged stock gone into this, and also possibly because there's more proper sherry casks gone into this. It's less bourbonised and tastes much older and, in general, much, much better. So in terms of old antique spirits compared to their modern counterparts, what have we learnt? I think regarding this one and similar experiments I've done with other antique spirits, it does seem like decades ago they were putting much more highly aged stock into their basic single malts and blends as well. So back then you were getting some really well aged stuff at what today seems like a really reasonable price. So is it all bad? What have we got today that they didn't have back then? The main thing that I would say is choice, availability and access to a wider range of whiskies. More distilleries today are choosing to bottle a wider range of age statement whiskies. Even in today's climate where more distilleries are removing age statements, there's still much more choice than there was decades ago. And also a lot more distilleries are available as a single malt these days. Whereas in the past, a lot of distilleries, their entire produce was lost in blends and completely unavailable to the public. I'd also say that today we're lucky in that the majority of distilleries choose to bottle at a proper drinking strength, being 43 or preferably 46%. The list of distilleries producing quality whisky but choosing to bottle it at the minimum strength of 40% is getting shorter and shorter, with the main offenders of distilleries that really ruin quality whisky being Laphroaig and Highland Park. So which is better, whisky now or whisky then? I'd say it really comes down to whether you really like your aged whisky or if you like a bit more choice and variety. I'd say that one thing is that the minimum quality of whisky today is much higher than it was in the past, but also in today's whisky market the really good stuff is quite often just completely prohibitively expensive and out of most people's range. I was actually going to do an A-B comparison with the 1980s bottling of the 12-year-old with the modern 12-year-old Viking Honor, but I think that when these whiskies are just so amazingly different, there's so little in common, it's really not much point doing an A-B comparison. You'd probably be much better off doing a comparison of the 1980s bottling of the 12-year-old alongside something like the modern 21-year-old. I'll see if I can do something about that soon. Cheers.